History as it happens, April 18th, 2023. Heritage of Treason.
I signed the Confederate Heritage Month in the month of April in the same manner and fashion that the 5 governors that came before me, Republicans and Democrats alike, for over 30 years have done that. And
all elements of Mississippi and all elements of American history, both the good and the bad, should be taught in our schools, period.
In Mississippi, Governor Tate Reeves has once again proclaimed April Confederate Heritage Month. He says as we honor all who lost their lives in the Civil War, it's important for all Americans to reflect upon our nation's past, to gain insight from our mistakes and successes. So what did the Confederacy actually succeed at? Why are some folks still trying to salvage something from the ruins? The lost cause dies hard. That's next as we report History as it happens, a podcast from the Washington Times. I'm Martin DeCaro.
The vacuousness of the proclamation in substantive terms, there's a kind of dog whistle quality about it, right? It's like you're sending out signals that you stand for things that you're unwilling any longer to say explicitly.
Our position is thoroughly identified with the institution of slavery, the greatest material interest in the world. So reads Mississippi's Declaration of Secession, January 9, 1861. It says the hostility to this institution commenced before the adoption of our Constitution. It refuses the admission of new slave states into the Union and seeks to extinguish it by confining it within its present limits, denying the power of expansion. Now, these words are definitive evidence that Mississippi seceded to protect human chattel slavery. But you won't find the words secession or slavery or racism anywhere in Governor Tate Reeves' proclamation making April Confederate Heritage Month. The soundbite you heard at the top of the podcast, that was Reeves defending his position at a news conference last year when he issued the same proclamation in April. He was asked, why are you doing this?
Look, I signed the Confederate Heritage Month in the month of April in the same manner and fashion that the 5 governors that came before me, Republicans and Democrats alike, for over 30 years have done that, and we did it again this year. Didn't think this was the year to stop doing it. So
now this is the same Tate Reeves who agreed to remove the Confederate battle emblem from the Mississippi state flag in 2021, but who also signed a bill last year banning the teaching of critical race theory without defining it in public schools.
Contrary to what some critics may claim, this bill in no way, in no shape, and in no form prohibits the teaching of history. Any claim that this bill will somehow stop Mississippi kids from learning about American history is just flat out wrong.
So when I spotted the headline about Confederate Heritage Month, my reaction was, really? After everything we've been through in this country recently? The Black Lives Matter protests in 2020, when Confederate statues were torn down by mobs or, in some cases, carefully removed by local governments. Because of what Confederate symbols mean. White supremacy, racism, slavery, Civil War. It took that painful summer of protest to finally get rid of the towering Confederate statues in Richmond, Virginia, to name one location. None was larger than the statue of General Robert E. Lee, and one of his descendants, the Reverend Robert W. Lee IV, agreed it was time.
This statue is a symbol of oppression, and if it is a symbol, it becomes an idol, and if it becomes an idol, I am convinced as a Christian that the idols must be torn down.
So why does Mississippi's governor think anyone still wants to honor Confederate heritage, other than members of the Sons of Confederate Veterans or a similar group? Did anyone really clamor for this proclamation? What message does it send to the roughly 40% of Mississippians who are black? Now, Reeves is right about one thing. It is important for Americans to reflect on the past, as his proclamation states. Polls continue to show that a significant number of Americans, even if it is a minority, still believe the main cause of the Civil War was something other than slavery. Now, this could simply be a result of ignorance or intellectual laziness rather than neo-Confederate ideology, but still, there is nothing worth salvaging from the Confederacy. It brought ruin upon the South, and during its short existence, it distinguished itself for terrible governance. Jefferson Davis and Robert E. Lee were traitors as far as I'm concerned. Traitors who fought for a dishonorable cause. So yes, let's learn about the Confederacy, but the facts, not the lost cause myth. Historian James Oakes is somewhat of a regular guest on the podcast, and more importantly, he is the author of many superb books on this subject, and the one I read to prepare for the conversation was one of his first, published in 1990, Slavery and Freedom, An Interpretation of the Old South. Jim Oakes, welcome back.
Hi. How you doing, Martin? Good to be back.
Happy Confederate Heritage Month. Kidding. I am kidding. But, it is good to have you back. I always look for reasons to have some of my favorite guests back. And all of a sudden, I see a headline the other day that Mississippi, the governor, Tate Reeves, has declared this April once more Confederate Heritage Month. I don't know if you had any reaction to this, but when I saw it, I think my reaction was out loud. Are you kidding me? After everything we've been through in this country. And this is the same state, same governor that actually did get rid of their Confederate battle flag. They're going back to this. And what was your reaction?
Part of me thinks this is the last dying gasp of a kind of admiration for the Confederacy that, for the most part, even conservatives have repudiated. Right? Nowadays, my friend Matt Karp published a piece recently, maybe a year ago in Harper's, where he pointed out that conservatives have accepted Lincoln, accepted anti-slavery, accepted, and embraced that. And it's more the liberals who are rejecting that. So neo-Confederate ideology is an increasingly marginal piece of what the conservative movement represents. It used to be a much bigger part. So in some ways, it's a bizarre holdover. I hope it's not a harbinger of a revival.
Yeah, you never know, right?
And the use of the term heritage, that was kind of the dodge that the neo-Confederates tried to use to get around what the Confederacy actually was by saying, it represented something larger in the culture that didn't necessarily have to do with slavery.
Well, then it should be Southern heritage rather than Confederate heritage.
Yeah, they fudged that.
Well, heritage...
what the Confederacy actually represented is so reprehensible.
We're going to get into that. Heritage is defined by valued objects and qualities, reading from the dictionary here, such as cultural traditions, unspoiled countryside, and historic buildings that have been passed down from previous generations. The implication being that this is a positive thing you want to hold on to and even celebrate. So I'm going to give these folks the benefit of the doubt, or just take them at their word and play along here that there is a Confederate heritage worth holding on to. Let's look at the proclamation put out by the governor in Mississippi. It says in part, whereas, as we honor all who lost their lives in the Civil War, it's important for all Americans to reflect upon our nation's past, to gain insight from our mistakes and successes, and to come to a full understanding that the lessons learned yesterday and today will carry us through tomorrow if we carefully and earnestly strive to understand and appreciate our heritage and our opportunities which lie before us. So no mention of slavery in there. I guess that's...
No mention anything. Yeah. It's the most banal, empty statement. I can imagine it commits you to nothing. Absolutely nothing. It's weird. The degree to which that essentially indicates, in a way, the bankruptcy of the concept of Confederate heritage, that he can't cite a single specific value or ideal that Confederate heritage supposedly represents. That he can only say, we learned from the past. We must learn from the past. Okay. Tell me what we need to learn from the past, right? I remember when I was a kid, I was shocked. I heard this guy say that the greatest mistake Hitler made was that he didn't kill all the Jews, right? I remember hearing that and thinking, well, he learned from the past. What is it? It doesn't mean anything to say we should learn from the past. Tell me what we should learn from the past, and we can have a discussion.
I think this is more a statement about what's happening today, especially now with our country so deeply divided. It's almost like sending a message. We still kind of, sort of, or maybe really believe in states' rights, and we shall defy the federal government if we so choose.
Yeah, and that, of course, was part of the mythology of Confederate heritage, that they were somehow in favor of states' rights, when any historian who knows anything about it will say that that is not what the pro-slavery Southerners were demanding. They were demanding exactly the opposite. And one of the reasons there was a civil war is because they imposed a federal fugitive slave law on the nation over and against, what the Northerners wanted in order to override the protections that Northern states, one after another, had instituted, the due process rights of accused fugitives, right? This is not a states' rights position, right? And it was the state of Wisconsin that nullified the federal fugitive slave law. In the Confederacy, it's notorious. The Confederate government was overriding state prerogatives one after another all through the Civil War. So part of that mythology about we're for states' rights, and look at it right now. Are you really going to tell us that the Republican Party is for state rights? I'm not sure that you can say that.
So to what extent does lost cause mythology, because that's really what all this is about,
that's right.
How does it still, and this is a tough question, and I don't live in Mississippi, so how much does it influence ordinary Mississippians' views of the war and history? I mean, is it even possible to tell? I mean, at one point, the historical profession was all on board with the lost cause, but that was a long time ago.
It was a very long time ago. I have no idea what percentage of Mississippians believe that. I'd be surprised if you'd find many African-American Mississippians who believe that, but you never know. But again, my impression is that the bulk of the conservative movement in the United States has moved away from that kind of thinking, and now, as the emptiness of the proclamation you read suggests, it stands for almost nothing.
Yeah, we've discussed the education issue here before, and because there are so many school districts in our massive country of 310 million people, it's really hard to know what's being taught in one school district versus another, whether the lost cause still pervades education. I mean, it used to be in pop culture, Gone with the Wind.
The situation's very simple. The Yankees can't fight and we can.
You're right. There won't even be a battle, that's what I think. They'll just turn and run every time.
One Southerner can lick 20 Yankees.
Why, we'll finish them in one battle. Gentlemen can always fight better than rattle.
Yes, gentlemen always fight better than rabble.
And what does the captain of our troop say?
Well, gentlemen, if Georgia fights, I go with her. But like my father, I hope that the Yankees will let us leave the Union in peace.
I want to take back some of what I've been saying. There is a way in which, notwithstanding the vacuousness of the proclamation in substantive terms, there's a kind of dog whistle quality about it, right? It's like you're sending out signals that you stand for things that you're unwilling any longer to say explicitly. It's a little like, in the way like the Willie Horton ad, right? You're not explicitly saying you support what the Confederacy stood for, but then why say it? Then what exactly are you doing when you issue a proclamation like that?
Unlike this declaration, I'll cite the Declaration of January 9th, 1861, a declaration of the immediate causes which induce and justify the secession of the state of Mississippi from the federal union.
Right.
Quote, our position is thoroughly identified with the institution of slavery, the greatest material interest of the world. Its labor supplies the product which constitutes by far the largest and most important portions of commerce of the earth. These products are peculiar to the climate verging on the tropical regions, and by imperious law of nature, none but the black race can bear exposure to the tropical sun. I mean, this is in the Declaration. Right. So I think we know what Confederate heritage is about. I mean, let's get to the point here. This is what Confederate heritage is, right?
Yes. You put a room of 100 U.S. historians and ask them what caused the Civil War, and they'll all say slavery, and ask them for proof, and what they will cite is that very specific document you read, and the South Carolina Declaration, and they'll cite the reasons the secessionists gave for leaving the Union, which was to protect slavery. There simply isn't any doubt. The fundamental difference between the U.S. Constitution and the Confederate Constitution is the explicit and repeated defense of a constitutional right of property in man. It's what's missing from the U.S. Constitution, famously, is any reference to slaves as property, and always as persons. Now, historians disagree about what that means, but it's very clear that the anti-slavery people made a big deal of the fact that slaves are repeatedly referred to as persons in the Constitution. And the Confederate Constitution precluded that possibility by explicitly asserting that slaves were property and constitutionally protected as such. Otherwise, all the differences between the U.S. Constitution and the Confederate Constitution are kind of inconsequential, minor. One 6-year term for the presidency instead of 2 4-year terms. Well, there was no 2 4-year terms instead of 4-year re-electable terms.
Actually, there was a reason why they had to rewrite constitutions that were explicitly pro-slavery.
Yeah. That's what the Confederacy is all about.
Mississippi's population today is about 40% black. Is there anything about Confederate heritage that black people would want to celebrate?
I can't speak for black people. It's hard for me to imagine that there's anything in Confederate heritage that all that many people, if you take what the Confederacy means, what the Confederacy was, there's virtually nothing in it that's defensible.
For white or black. I want to get to this now.
Yeah, for anybody.
So we're going to go along with this, right? Okay, we have to celebrate our heritage. So antebellum Mississippi had 3 main agricultural regions, the most prominent of which was the cotton plantation districts along the river below the delta.
Right.
There was also, though, in one part of the state, an area without many slaves, with poor white yeoman farmers who worked small plots, often as tenants or sharecroppers. We often think of sharecropping as a post-Civil War thing, but they existed prior to the war. What was life like for them prior to the war?
Well, yeah, that's a really important question. One of the things that the slave economy did was preclude the possibility of advancement for small farmers, right? Lincoln famously said that the ideal situation in the North was, you start your life as an employee, maybe as not a tenant farmer, but say you go to work for another farmer, and then you save up and you get a plot of your own land, and eventually you'll hire people on your own. But in the South, there is not enough economic development. And the economic development is thwarted by the slave economy. It's incompatible with the slave economy, such that the opportunities for advancement by small farmers, they couldn't get to the best lands because the best lands are all monopolized by the big slaveholders. So you get over the course of this reason why over the course of the 19th century, tens of thousands of white Southerners are leaving the South and moving into Southern Illinois, into Southern Indiana, into the Western states where slavery is banned, right? Because the opportunities for any kind of advancement, personal advancement and prosperity in the South are substantially diminished by the slave economy. Rates of tenancy and landlessness among small farmers in the South are increasing over the course of the decades before the Civil War. It's just becoming more and more inequitable. The proportion of people in the South who are able to own slaves is shrinking steadily. It creates what many of us believe was a kind of social crisis in the South. The slaveholders are obsessed with the potential for disloyalty among the non-slaveholders because the opportunities for them to make their way up the limited social ladder, get your own land, maybe buy a slave, are shrinking over the course of time. This is not a haven for yeoman farmers to make their way in the world, whereas Northern agricultural prosperity was quite substantial.
There were class fissures and tensions among whites in the South, not just in Mississippi, but we'll stick with that state.
And the Free State of Jones?
Yeah, I need to see that movie, The war exacerbated these fissures, right?
Yeah.
Ordinary white folks who were poor, again, had no chance of ever having enough money or enough land to justify buying and owning slaves. Looking at this war as a rich man's war, right?
Well,
maybe.
Yes, it's an interesting and very complicated and controversial subject among historians. The initial reaction of non-slaveholding whites to secession was hostility, but as we've seen in all recent U.S. history, when the country goes to war, there's a rallying behind the government in favor of whatever military action the government's taking. And so where white Southerners were in November of 1860 isn't necessarily where they were the day after Fort Sumter was fired upon, right? So there's a change in public opinion among non-slaveholders. It looks like there's a kind of war fever and a lot of suppression of any anti-war sentiment among the non-slaveholders. And yet, over the course of the war, as the war drags on, you get increasing amounts of hostility emanating from non-slaveholders, objections to the so-called 20 Negro rule, in which exempts planters from having to fight in the war from the conscription policies that the Confederate government adopts, which is viewed correctly as an exemption for rich people, right? If you have 20 slaves, you don't have to go fight, even though the war is about fighting for slavery. And by the end of the war, by the last year of the war, the defections, as war weariness takes hold in the South, the Confederates cannot hold on to their soldiers, and vast numbers of non-slaveholders are defecting and leaving the army, making Southern military defeat virtually inevitable by the last year of the war.
But you know, Jim, folks who say, well, Confederate Heritage Month isn't about slavery or this or that, they'll point to the very facts you just mentioned, that most white people in the state did not own slaves. They had no stake in slavery. They wouldn't have gone off and fought for some system that they weren't participating in. But there is this quote that appears in a book published in 1990 by one James Oakes. That would be you. Slavery and Freedom. You've read it, you said. Oh, you also wrote it. Slavery and Freedom, an Interpretation of the Old South. At the start of Chapter 3, which is Slaveholders and Non-Slaveholders, you cite the Richmond Enquirer, Richmond, Virginia, which was the capital of the Confederacy, a newspaper from 1856. In this country alone does perfect equality of civil and social privilege exist among the white population. And when they're referring to country, they're talking about their state.
Right.
And it exists solely because we have black slaves. Freedom is not possible without slavery.
Right.
So the slaveocracy in a place like Mississippi or Virginia would try to convince poor whites that you may have a lousy lot in life, but you'll never be as low as a black slave who exists outside society.
Yeah, this is a perfect example of what Barbara and Karen Fields called racecraft, in which the function of the idea of race and racial difference is to cover over the fundamental class divisions in society. So claiming, in a state of Virginia, of all places, claiming that there's perfect equality, the concept of equality is narrowed down to the most minimal formal legal rights, civil rights. And even in Virginia, Virginia's notorious as one of the last states to adopt anything like equal suffrage, even for white men. It's the only state in the Union to ever split in two because of the class divisions between Western Virginia and the slaveholding powers in Eastern Virginia and the Piedmont. Literally, the divisions were so severe that there's a sense in which the function of that kind of editorial in the Richmond Enquirer was to paper over these very real, long-standing conflicts between the non-slaveholding regions of the state and the planting regions of the state, and using race as a way of papering over those divisions.
Why are there no Union Heritage Months anywhere? I grew up in New York and New Jersey, mostly New Jersey. We never had.
Yeah, it's true. It's true. Northerners do not think about the Civil War the way Southerners do. I remember when I first went to the South to do my dissertation research and being stunned by the pervasiveness of the Civil War and the Confederacy, even among people in areas that were not conservative. I went to Chapel Hill and Durham to do my research, and the connecting road between Chapel Hill and Durham, which I traveled 100 times if I traveled it once, it was the Jefferson Davis Highway. Why would you name a road to Jefferson Davis?
Exactly. My naivete as well. I moved down to D.C. about 12 years ago, and right over the river in liberal Democratic, that would be today's liberals, not the 1850 Democratic Party, Arlington, Virginia, they had, Lee Highway. Really?
Yeah.
I understand they had the statues in Richmond, some of which have come down. That You know, I don't like that, but that was the capital of the Confederacy. But even here, Lee Highway?
Right.
Well,
It's important. This is something that historians rightly insisted we notice when the statue issue became significant 10 or so years ago, is that those statues and those highways and those names are not a function of the post-Civil War South. They're a function of the early 20th century South, when Jim Crow was at its height. And again, it became absolutely essential to paper over some of the fundamental class divisions that were part and parcel of Southern social life at that time by insisting on the racial uniformity and equality of all white people over against black people. Even as the state of Virginia was systematically disfranchising whites along with blacks, so that there's some astonishing figure that by 1820, only 7% of the adults in Virginia were eligible to vote. I mean, they're not just throwing out black people. They're going after black people, but the 15th Amendment prevents them from writing rules that say black people can't vote. So they pass all these mechanisms of disfranchisement that inevitably sweep up large numbers of whites, literacy tests, grandfather clauses, things like that. And they're perfectly content to sweep up large numbers of poor whites in the process of disfranchising blacks. And that's when the rhetoric, as during the Confederacy, that's when the rhetoric of white unity and white supremacy is most intense, at a time when that sharecropping regime of the Jim Crow South is most entrenched. That's when they start building these statutes. That's when they start emphasizing Confederate heritage. That's when the roads get named and things like that.
Yeah, one of the Lee statues that just came down somewhere, maybe in Richmond, was erected in the 1920s. And a couple of days before that unveiling of the statue, I think the Klan held a parade.
Yeah.
Well, you said before, Southerners think differently about the Civil War than Northerners do. I mean, I was taught
they think more about it.
More about it. This is my view of the reason for that, and the reason why there was a lost cause myth. Because the Confederacy was a disaster, the war brought on disaster and ruin to places like Mississippi, and the cause for which was fought, human chattel slavery, was eradicated. It brought shame upon them. So they had to replace it with something.
Well, again, who's doing the inventing and to what end, right? It's a very particular class of people who are inventing this mythology for reasons that had to do with the social and political conditions of the South in 1900 rather than the actual outcome of the Civil War, right? And, things have changed very dramatically. When I first encountered that phenomenon, that was a long time ago. That was in the late 70s. And things were happening in the South, to Southern politics, that make it very difficult to talk about white Southerners, how white Southerners felt or how Southerners felt, right? They were electing people like Jimmy Carter and Ernest Hollings. And there was a whole generation of white Southern politicians who just did not come out of that segregationist, white supremacist tradition. It was dying. It's very hard to say, for me anyway, what I saw reflected the way Southerners think, or even at that point still thought about the Civil War. It's a holdover. I was seeing the holdover from that earlier Jim Crow South. It's tricky to talk about Southerners in broad terms of white Southerners, even, or black Southerners, because it's just not the case anymore. The South is so fundamentally different from what it was 50, certainly 100 years ago when those statues went up.
I guess that's the trap that is set when there are proclamations such as this one, and folks like me want to discuss them or debate them or criticize them. It's easy to fall into some of these traps in generalizing. But even for whites, as we've been discussing, there was conscription, draft exemptions for planters, you mentioned that, the tax in kind, Confederate impressment policies, all heightened tensions, reading from the Mississippi Encyclopedia online. And, of course, the Mississippi economy was left in ruins by damage and, of course, the end of slavery, etc. So there's very little to celebrate here and much to lament, and I think that's what gets me about these Confederate Heritage Months. This is a wound that we should be healing, not picking at or reopening and saying, well, maybe there's something here to salvage. You don't go to Germany today and see statues of the Waffen-SS and have somebody say to you, well, the war was wrong, but they fought bravely.
Right. No, that's absolutely right. That tendency to erase the differences by talking about, well, as you say, they all fought bravely. They were patriotic in their own way, and things like that. That kind of stuff that eradicates the purpose of the war. The reason there was a Confederacy is crazy. And it's not a question of, it can't be a question of saying, the white South is guilty. It can't be that. It has to be a question of accepting and confronting the reality of the history. It's not that this makes the North a treasury of virtue, as Robert Penn Warren once suggested. It can't be that, and it isn't that. It's about just being honest about the history of the United States. It's like, can anybody write about the history of the United States without acknowledging the systematic dispossession of native peoples? You can't. It doesn't mean we should be rubbing our hands and wallowing in guilt. It just means confronting the reality of the past.
And it happened in Mississippi, and those lands were turned into cultivating for
It happened in New England.
Yes.
It happened in Ohio. It happened everywhere. There is no place on earth. I mean, if you
happen to be speaking about Mississippi here, but go ahead, yeah.
Yeah. The point isn't to expose complicity. The point is to just get the story straight, right? And not whitewash it. It's not about wallowing in guilt. It's about, if you're not being honest about the past, then why study it?
I hope I don't sound too preachy here today. So, about getting the story right, was the Confederacy treason? Were these traitors, their leaders?
That, for me, has always been a tricky question. It's become popular to talk about. In one sense, yes, they are making war against the United States, the government of the United States, and in that sense, the entire business is a sustained act of treason. On the other hand, I think about what it was that got John Brown convicted. John Brown was convicted for treason against the state of Virginia. And until the 14th Amendment, you were a citizen of a state prior to maybe being a citizen of the United States. So if you are a Virginian or a Mississippian, and your state secedes from the Union, you have to choose between, are you going to be loyal to the United States or are you going to be loyal to your state? And you will either be a traitor to your state or a traitor to the United States, right? There's no way to avoid it, right? And in that sense, every person who goes with the seceded states is a traitor to the United States. In that sense, they couldn't avoid being traitors to the United States. The people that I find most culpable in that sense are the people like John Breckinridge from Kentucky, who ran for president in 1860 and defected to the Confederacy. His state did not secede from the Union. He had no choice to make. He wasn't forced to make any choice. He chose treason. And there
so did
are
General Lee. General Lee also.
Yeah, he chose to go with his state. He had to make a choice,
That's
right? But Breckinridge didn't.
Well,
there was no choice.
General Lee would have called it his country.
Yeah, well, that's no. I mean, Alan Gelzo, in his recent biography of Lee, makes the best case I've seen for thinking of him as a traitor. After all, there were other Southern generals, George Thomas, for example, Virginians, who stayed loyal. He had taken an oath of loyalty to the United States as a member of the U.S. Armed Forces, and he maintained his commitment to that oath.
And as we know from William Freeling's great book, South versus South, hundreds of thousands of Southerners fought for the Union. Virtually no Northerners fought for the South.
Yes, there's nothing like that. There's nothing. I wouldn't say hundreds of thousands, but yes.
Okay.
Tens of thousands.
Tens of thousands.
I mean, I've heard people say that more Mississippians fought for the U.S., fought for the Union than for the Confederacy. If you count the black soldiers who fight, then it's possible. It's possible. But you're right. The South is very deeply internally divided. I mean, no northern state joins the Confederacy, but 4 slave states failed to join the Confederacy. And that's an indication, the states that had the smallest percentage of slaveholders, Delaware, Maryland, Kentucky, and Missouri, and had the strongest ties to the North, did not leave. And that's a devastating loss to the Confederacy right at the start. They cannot even get all the slaves states to come into the Confederacy with them, right?
It made a big difference in manpower and resources and railroads and also just the geography of where those states sat.
Sure.
Right?
I mean, this is a point Lincoln made clearly in the first year of the war. If we lose Kentucky, We're likely to lose Maryland, and then the game is up. We can't win a war without those states. And Jefferson Davis knew the same thing. Jefferson Davis was as obsessed with getting Kentucky into the Confederacy as Lincoln was obsessed with keeping it in the Union, because it was the borderland between the North and the South. Losing that was disastrous for the Confederacy for a number of reasons. But
couple of more items here, James Oakes. Where do you fall on the statue controversy? Should Confederate statues or place names or monuments be taken down?
Yeah, I think so. I think they're offensive. I think there are people like Jefferson Davis and John C. Calhoun and Nathan Bedford Forrest whose only claim to historical recognition is their participation in the rebellion against the United States. It's not like a statue of Thomas Jefferson or George Washington, people who have major contributions to the founding of the United States, despite the fact that they were slaveholders. Right? So that their being slaveholders is an important part of what we need to know about them, but it's not all we need to know about them. That's not true of Jefferson Davis. That's not true of John C. Calhoun. His claim to fame, Calhoun's claim to fame, it was as a defender of the rights of slaveholders and slave states, right? And Jefferson Davis would be completely unknown entity if it weren't for the fact that he made himself, in the wake of Calhoun's death, into Calhoun's major protege and successor in defending slavery and becoming the president of the Confederacy. There's no reason to memorialize people who have no claim to historical recognition other than their racist defenses of slavery.
For folks who may question what you're saying here, I would tell them to seek out Jefferson Davis's speeches on the Senate floor about slavery and ask yourself if that's somebody that we should be honoring today. You know, the statue controversy can be tricky because then where do you stop? I think you draw a good line talking about people whose only claim to historical significance is this versus others. Also, we are alive today to make use of our public places. Not that tradition isn't important, right? But to make use of our public places the way we see fit. And if I don't want to look at a statue of a traitor, I can petition my city council to do something about that.
Right.
Last subject, Jim, and I will encourage all people listening to pick up your book, Slavery and Freedom, An Interpretation of the Old South, first published in 1990, because there has been some confusion recently about the relationship between slavery and capitalism. Matter of fact, in the Hulu docuseries that 1619 Project did, the second episode is about that relationship, and its conclusion or argument is we have capitalism today because of slavery. You argue in your book that capitalism drove the development of human chattel slavery as a class of property and labor force. So it's the other way around.
They get it backwards. There's a close relationship between the development of capitalism and the development of New World slavery, but it's the reverse of the one that things like the 1619 Project are getting. It's actually most clear in the history of the United States, right? At the time the Constitution was drafted, there's virtually no cotton being produced in the country. The planters in South Carolina are clamoring for a cotton gin in 1893 because the cotton factories have already been built in England and they're clamoring for cotton. The Slater mill went up in Pawtucket, Rhode Island, the first textile mill in the United States, a year before Eli Whitney patented his cotton gin, right? So the cotton factory calls the cotton plantation into existence, not the other way around. It's that demand for the products of slave labor by a growing population of consumers in England and the North who now have the prosperity or the need to survive by buying sugar, coffee, and cotton and cocoa. It's that capitalist demand for the products of slave labor that is sustaining the growth of these plantation economies, right? It's not the other way around. It's primarily demand emanating from a much more robust and rapidly developing capitalist economy in England and the North that is the tie between these two. And if it was the case that capitalism needed slavery, then the destruction of slavery in the English colonies and then later in the United States ought to have led to the catastrophic collapse of the Northern economy, but it didn't. It didn't because the North didn't need slavery. The slave economy needed capitalism. If you read the Financial Times or The Economist, there's a concept called commodity dependence. They talk about economies that are commodity dependent on the assumption that commodity-dependent economies like the Slave South inhibit economic development and are unable to develop in ways that are, robust in any way, right? The UN report on commodity dependence in 2021 says commodity dependence is associated with an inability to develop in any robust way. That's what the South was. It was always, as a slave economy, commodity dependent. It was dependent on the sale of tobacco. It was dependent on the sale of rice. It was dependent on the sale of sugar. And above all, in the 19th century, it was dependent on the sale outside the South of this particular commodity, cotton. And I think people are too dazzled by statistics like, 65% of the exports were cotton. That doesn't tell you anything. If exports are only 5% of the economy, that doesn't tell you very much. They've reversed the significance of commodity dependence and treat it as though it's a sign of wealth and prosperity when it's not. It's not. It's just not. It's the reason the South is backwards. Go back to what we were talking about earlier. It inhibits the ability of non-slaveholders to prosper. It's not a healthy way to organize an economy.
And as you argue in this second chapter of your book, the American Revolution posed a challenge for the slaveholding class. If you're going to live in a liberal society, well, then how can you square that with your ownership of human beings who also are supposedly worthy of the same rights that you have, right? The primacy of individual rights in a liberal society, they make carve-outs, they make exceptions for slaves, which is a way of defining their freedom by negating, right?
Yes.
Through a series of negations.
Well, the slaves are, by definition, property, and liberal ideology is founded on the principle of protection of property. And then the question is, who are you going to make property? And there you need a racial ideology to justify the specific enslavement of people you deem to be racially distinctive, racially inferior, racially suited to enslavement. Right? So racism and the right of property in human beings are inseparable in the defense of slavery. You can't have, it's impossible to imagine a defense of slavery in a liberal republic without a racial ideology to justify who is and who is not going to be enslaved. If it's just the right of property, then you can make property out of poor white people and women or any group you want to make property. The racial ideology serves to specify who it is that's going to be enslaved.
Your book came out in 1990. The thing that gets me about 1619 out of the arguments, the worst conceit about all of this stuff is that, this story's never been told before, or we haven't gotten it right until now. Your book is 33 years old, and like the entire field of scholarship, right? It's been sitting on library shelves for decades.
I know.
Well, not that we need to go down that road again.
It's pretty frustrating.
Well, enjoy what's left of Confederate.
I'll go home and sing Dixie.
Now that's more like it. On the next episode of History as It Happens, an American journalist in Russia is arrested and charged with spying. It's an international outrage. It happened to the Wall Street Journal's Evan Gershkovich. And 40 years ago, it happened to Nicholas Danilov. And it endangered the good progress in U.S.-Russia relations on the road to Reykjavik. The Danilov Affair of 1986. Next, as we report History as It Happens, a podcast from the Washington Times.